All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session, How to Talk About Sex with Survivors. My name is Martina Shabram, and I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for Sexual Assault Support Services in Lane County. I'm really excited to be able to share this material with you all, and I hope that you can join us for the live discussion session where we can take some of what I'll be presenting to you here today and turn it into actual praxis. There is just so much to talk about on this subject, so let's jump right in. I just want to start by acknowledging how hard this material can be. Given that you're attending this summit, I feel like I can assume that you've thought through how to best care for yourself as you take in this material. But even when we feel really resourced and prepared, we can all still get surprised by the emotions that come up. So I want to model the kind of trauma-informed principles that we'll be talking about today and say that I trust each of you to care for yourself in whatever way you know is best. Pause this video and take a break, do some grounding exercises, close your eyes, whatever you need to do. In fact, while I'll have information on the screen throughout this whole presentation, I'll try to verbalize when there's something important to look at so that if you prefer, you can disconnect a little from the screen. And a final note that you can always reach out to SAS's 24/7 crisis and support hotline if you could use a little extra space to process. So what are we going to do in this session? Well, let's actually start with what this workshop can't do. It can't instantly make everyone 100% comfortable and confident talking about sex. Your knowledge, your values, and your personal comfort really do matter. So there's no expectation that you have to walk out of this workshop feeling totally comfortable talking about the topics that we discussed today, right? Topics that might still feel awkward to you. That is okay. We're not going to be able to give you all of the information that you'll ever need to feel comfortable and confident that you'll say the exact right thing. Knowledge and language and practices continue to change and grow, and so all we can do is be continually engaged in the practice of learning and growing. And that is what this workshop will do, give you a chance to learn and grow. And hopefully give you some tools that you can use to continually learn and grow on this topic in the future. So we'll have a chance to think critically about how to center consent in clinical practice. We'll try out some tools for assessing the language we use and checking for whether it's harmful. And I'll offer some specific reframes that I've found useful for some of the common language that can be harmful in working with survivors. So here is the actual agenda of what we're going to do. I'll briefly introduce SAS before we do anything else, and then we will talk about institutional trauma and the ways, some of the practices that we can implement to mitigate this form of trauma. And then we'll finally talk about sex specifically, covering some really important issues related to neurophysiology, reproductive health, and sexual trauma, survivor-centered language in clinical setting, and centering consent in a clinical setting. So I'll start by introducing SAS. We are a nonprofit that serves survivors of sexual violence, as well as their families, partners, and communities. We run many programs, including emergency medical advocacy, legal advocacy, support groups, the kind of education I'm doing right now, and more. And our core is perhaps the 24/7 crisis and support hotline, which I've already alluded to. All of our services are free, available to survivors of all genders. And maybe most importantly, we are 100% anonymous and confidential. Our staffers are privileged advocates, so survivors can feel safe to reach out without worrying about the possibility of a mandated report or disclosure of their information to anyone. And advocacy privilege extends even to minors, which is an important distinction for a lot of providers. Let's get into the good stuff then. We're going to start by talking about systemic oppression. And that's because in order to really get into anything else, we need to start by ensuring that everyone is grounded in the basics of taking an intersectional approach to understanding systemic and institutional oppression. This is going to be an incredibly brief overview, and I recommend that everyone spend much more time learning deeply about these issues. But for now, we'll start with this overview. And to give credit where it's due, the concept of intersectionality comes from Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, whose work on intersectional Black liberation really defines the framework through which SAS approaches the issue of sexual violence. So we need to situate ourselves in the broader context of individual versus systemic oppression. You may want to draw your attention to the screen for a moment where I'm sharing a really useful diagram from the National Equity Project that helps to explain the interplay between individual and systemic oppression. For a long time, the mainstream approach to addressing oppression has focused on individual oppression through things like implicit bias trainings. And that is important. Our individual beliefs and biases absolutely affect how we treat others implicitly and explicitly. So working to understand the oppressive beliefs we hold and unlearn those biases is incredibly important. However, we also need to attend to systems of oppression. Systemic oppression refers to the institutions and structures that create oppressive conditions. The systems run on their own, whether or not the people operating within them share those oppressive beliefs or are even aware that those beliefs are what is animating the system. So when we call out systemic racism, for example, it doesn't mean that we are pointing to an environment and saying, we know that there are a lot of racist people there. Instead, we're acknowledging that the system itself has been designed to create racism, regardless of the beliefs of the people working within it. And that's important because we can't change outcomes by just changing individual beliefs unless we also change the systems that operate irrespective of our beliefs. And make no mistake, we are all living and working within systems of oppression. And the way that we think and talk about those systems matters. We have to be engaged in changing both our beliefs and our systems concurrently, which means focusing on both our individual actions and also working within our institutions to drive positive change. So why does an organization like SAS spend so much time thinking about oppression? Well, at SAS, we understand that sexual violence is a tool of oppression and a manifestation of oppressive beliefs, and that sexual trauma is exacerbated by oppressive systems. So to support survivors, we have to understand how a person's intersectional identities influence the way they experience systemic institutional oppression. Structural and institutional racism, misogyny, ableism, transphobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, etc., have created environments that churn out oppression, including sexual violence. But thinking intersectionally shows how interconnected forms of oppression are. We can, for example, think of narratives about the responsibility of white men to protect the sexual purity of white women from the threat of Black men, a threat that is and has always been entirely made up. And these narratives were explicitly used to justify the founding of the first Klan, and they're part of the storyline of Birth of a Nation. And we can look at those narratives, that history, and draw a direct line to police violence against Black men today. Likewise, on the other side of this narrative about white women as sexually pure is the exotification and dehumanization of BIPOC women, which is directly connected to both the kind of white supremacist violence that we recently saw in the mass murder of Asian American women in Atlanta, and also to the history of the eugenics movement in America and systemic sterilization of BIPOC women. I mean, I could go on and talk about the unethical medical experimentation on Puerto Rican women during the 1950s hormonal birth control trials, or about the treatment of migrants at the southern U.S. border today, who are today being held in concentration camps. All of these things are interconnected with the same narratives that drive sexual violence. And that is why SAS cares about dismantling oppression within ourselves and within communities. And since we all here work within systems, when we work on ourselves, we're also doing work on those systems. The more attentive we are as agents of oppressive systems to dismantling those systems, the more likely we are to create better outcomes. Because like I said, we are part of a system that has been engineered to churn out the conditions that lead to sexual violence and other forms of oppression. But if people engineered this system, then people can certainly engineer a better one. And that is what I believe we are all here today to work on. So, as a provider, this is perhaps most evident when we think about institutional trauma and betrayal. So let's talk about this concept that was first introduced by Dr. Jennifer Fried. Fried defines this form of trauma as wrongdoings perpetrated by an institution upon individuals dependent on that institution, including failure to prevent or respond supportively to wrongdoings by individuals committed within the context of the institution. Pause for a moment and see if you can come up with an example of this kind of wrongdoing. What came to mind? There are plenty of examples that we could use to illustrate this concept. Everything from police officers accusing a survivor of lying, to teachers saying, "Oh, they're only bugging you to get a rise out of you, just ignore them." We could include a lot of examples from the medical field. Everything from a clinician assuming that someone is drug seeking and denying them pain management, to the kind of medical bias that results in the disparate maternal mortality rates between white and Black and brown women. All of these examples fall under this institutional trauma and betrayal umbrella. So these are typically traumas that we think of as secondary to the primary trauma, i.e. the primary trauma is the assault and the secondary trauma is the response to that assault. But that does not mean that institutional trauma is less traumatic. In fact, many survivors say that it is sometimes harder to cope with and heal from the ways that institutions have betrayed them. Now, when providers engage in oppressive behavior or harmful behavior, they may be adding to that person's trauma and causing institutional betrayal. They might do this by implying that a person's experience doesn't, count, or through microaggressions, for example. So I want us to look at some ways that language can contribute to institutional trauma. Let's think about some of the terms used to describe the many types of experiences that fall under the umbrella of sexual violence. Here are some terms that relate to that broad category: rape, marital or spousal rape, acquaintance or date rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. Now, none of these terms are inherently good or bad or right or wrong, but the ways that they are used can be harmful. And examining the ways that this language is used, both in its context and history and also in its present use, can often illuminate other oppressive beliefs and attitudes that can lead to institutional trauma. So, we're going to go through each of these terms, and as we run through them, think about, what do they imply for you? What are the connotations? When you hear these terms, what associations come up in your mind, and what might that mean for survivors? Let's start with rape. Rape has specific legal definitions, but those definitions have also been different based on context, and they reflect the many assumptions about what quote-unquote counts as rape, all of which may make people feel that their experiences aren't represented. What rape means in one community at one moment may be very different at a different time or place. And those assumptions are interwoven with other cultural beliefs about sexual violence, such as beliefs that the perpetrator is always male and the victim always female, as well as other beliefs about race, class, sexual orientation, etc. And how the government defines this term is important as well. Here's the DOJ's definition. Rape: forced sexual intercourse including both psychological coercion as well as physical force. Forced sexual intercourse means penetration by the offender or offenders. Includes attempted rapes, male as well as female victims, and both heterosexual and same-sex rape. Attempted rape includes verbal threats of rape. When you hear that, what stands out for you? For me, I notice a lot of positive and inclusive language here. I also notice the use of the term heterosexual to describe sexual violence where the perpetrator is a different gender than the survivor. Does that term bring up anything for you? Sexual violence, as we're going to talk about more in a minute, is not sex. A person's sexual identity has nothing to do with acts of violence. Now, I understand that this definition is trying to articulate that sexual violence can occur when the perpetrator is the same or a different gender from the survivor, and that is really important. But that is not the same as heterosexual, and conflating an identity term with an action is troubling. For the next two terms, let's think about how terminology evolves and what that says about our understanding of the issue. The concept of marital or spousal rape is an addition to the legal definition of rape, and it wasn't a part of the legal definition or even much of the cultural connotation of the term until the 1970s. Think about what that implies. Likewise, acquaintance rape or date rape. The fact of the existence of these terms, that we've had to create these terms, tells us something about what the original assumptions about what a rape is were. You can see how we're setting up in the language a default. Even as the DOJ definition is in some ways trying to expand that default setting, the terminology still implies that the pure form of rape does not include either spouses or dates, even though the data indicates that over 80% of rape specifically occurs between people who are known to one another, not from stranger danger type situations. Now, these days, it's also pretty common to hear terms like sexual assault. Does that change the implication for you? Thinking about rape versus sexual assault can often be really complicated for a survivor who, in the acute aftermath of an experience of sexual violence, is often trying to come to understand what has happened to them and use the language around them to define their own experience. For some people, the term rape just doesn't seem to count for them, whereas sexual assault might better explain their experience. For others, the concept of assault is so clearly physical in some way that doesn't match what they understand their own experience to be, that the term just doesn't land. Now, these last two terms, sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, are also terms that have some historical context. Sexual harassment, again, has some very specific legal connotations. Sexual misconduct is broader, less specific, and in some ways also more related to a cultural idea of what appropriate sexual conduct is. So again, in all of these examples, the terms themselves are not inherently harmful or oppressive. They are on their own pretty neutral. But in context, language can be manifestation of oppressive beliefs, it can uphold oppressive beliefs, and it can also offer us inclusive and liberatory alternatives. And the impact of our language changes when we are in positions of power, as we are when we're providers in clinical settings. So though it can feel like nitpicking, being really attentive to the clinical language or even just the language we use in clinical settings can profoundly change the way survivors feel when they're under our care. So let's walk through some reframes for potentially harmful language that we often hear in relationship to sexual violence. For those of you who learn visually, this might be a good time to turn your attention to the screen where I have these reframes displayed. Let's start with an easy one. What might be challenging or harmful about referring to someone as a victim? Feel free to pause here for a minute and think of your own reframe. Now, victim is, of course, an important legal term, but it does define a person through the actions of their perpetrator. So using terms like survivor, which is a positive reframe, or person who has experienced sexual violence, which is a neutral reframe, can change things. Here's another one. Forced oral sex. Now, sexual violence, as I've already said, is not sex. And conflating sex with sexual violence or vice versa is incredibly harmful. Any form of sex requires consent. When we collapse that distinction, we're creating shame and perpetuating rape culture. So instead of asking a survivor, was there forced oral sex? We could say something more neutral, right? Just describing what kind of contact we need to know about. For example, we could ask, was there any contact between the perpetrator's genitals and your mouth? How about this one? Sex with a minor, or something like a sexual relationship with an underage woman or underage man or underage person. These are ways of softening the offense, substituting sex for violence, and hiding the survivor's age under a veneer of adult maturity. We often hear this in phrases like, the perpetrator was having a sexual relationship with an underage woman. But an underage woman is a girl, and an underage man is a boy. Let's not hide the unequal power dynamics that exist here. Let's call this what it is: sexual assault of a child, or sexual abuse or assault of a girl, boy, or kid. Now, how about child porn? For the perpetrator, seeing images of child sexual abuse is an experience of pornography. For the children involved, this is an experience of sexual abuse. So let's call it what it is: images of child sexual abuse. Now, in all of these examples, a useful tool can be asking ourselves, whose experience am I privileging or centering? If you find yourself asking a patient a question about what they've experienced, you can pause and check in about who the language is privileging or what it's assuming, who's being centered. This can be really hard to do in the moment, so I recommend practicing with your peers to check your language in advance. And this is a great plug for the live discussion session and the pre-session form that you can use to send me examples of language that you want to workshop in that session. So let's then get into sex specifically and turn our focus a little. Now, if we were in person together, I'd ask you all to raise your hand if you feel that at any point in your education, you received really clear, comprehensive, and positive training about sexual and reproductive health. If you specialize in sexual or reproductive health care, maybe you'd raise your hand. Maybe you feel really confident in your knowledge of sex, reproductive biology, birth control options, sexually transmitted infections. But in my experience, most clinicians aren't given the chance to become experts in this type of care. And if you were raised in the US, you may also never have had any quality sex education in your primary schooling. This leaves a lot of us with big gaps in our knowledge and comfort, and often means that the only language we've been taught is really sex negative, shame-based, and incomplete. I mean, how many of us experienced sex ed in high school that started and ended with basically, hey, don't have sex because you will get chlamydia and die. Now here are some condoms. Focusing on sex ed solely through the lens of STI and pregnancy prevention is like a cooking class that only ever covers salmonella. No one is going to learn how to cook a good chicken from that class. So I want to fill in some gaps in our framework today, but obviously this isn't a full sex ed basics course. If that's something that you would like, please feel free to contact me and we can arrange for some, trauma-informed, survivor-centered sex ed basics. But for today, we're going to focus on what I think is most important for clinical practice, and especially for SANEs and others working with survivors in the acute aftermath of sexual violence. Let's start by talking about neurophysiology and sexual trauma. I am going to assume that we're all familiar with the nervous system response of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, or fight, flight, freeze, and appease, depending on whether you prefer rhyming or alliteration. These 4 Fs absolutely affect a person's sexual responses. And I think that discussing freeze and fawn are particularly important when clinicians are talking to survivors about sex. Fawn in particular is such a stigmatized and little understood response that I think it bears some more explaining. Fawn, or appease, is when a person responds to a threat by caretaking, placating, or otherwise trying to please the attacker. This response is very common amongst people who experienced trauma and abuse in childhood, or who experienced ongoing violence within familial or romantic relationships. Anyone familiar with the dynamics of abuse will recognize this behavior. People learn to please their abuser to lessen the risk of an outburst. That instinct to please can, for many abuse survivors, become so deeply embedded in their behavior that it becomes indistinguishable from their personality. And it's something that is praised, especially for people who are perceived as women. So it can be hard to tease out, what is trauma response and what is just that person's personality. A survivor may have learned this survival skill and then, in the moment of a sexual assault, used it to survive. I've had many survivors share that they faked that they were enjoying what was happening in order to make their assailant finish faster, or that they didn't say no out loud because they feared making their abuser or their assailant angrier. This leads to so many survivors questioning their own experience and feeling that they asked for what happened to them because they went into a freeze or a fawn response. In fact, one of the most common questions that I receive as an advocate, even in the acute aftermath, is, why didn't I fight back? And so in those moments, without needing to go into, a treatise on brain development, I might offer some psychoeducation. Because some information about how the body instinctually responds to threats can really help a person reframe those responses that might be contributing to their feelings of shame. So I would typically do that like this. A lot of survivors have similar questions about why they reacted the way that they did. I can tell you for sure that your response was normal and natural. It's your brain's way of protecting you. Would it be helpful to talk a little bit about how the brain responds in traumatic situations? If the survivor is engaged enough and cognitively available enough to talk about the brain and says yes, then I might go into more detail here. I might actually get into a tiny treatise on brain development. Sometimes a little bit of intellectual distance can be a safe place for people to be. If they don't say yes, if they're not available for that, I might just say, your brain did what it had to do to survive. Whatever you did to stay safe and alive is okay. Now, the other reason why I want to focus on fawn is because we need to talk about how fawn can affect the relationship that a clinician or an advocate develops with the survivor. Without realizing it, a survivor may be in that appeasement mode, even for you, even for me. You may think that they're just a really easy patient when they're actually in their trauma response, performing that kind of good patient to appease you. So when we're talking about sexual and reproductive health care, or about the SAFE exam and their options, we need to be really intentional about how we're framing the choices that they can make. You may have your own beliefs about what survivors should do, but the survivor needs to be able to choose for themselves. It's not uncommon for advocates to hear people say things like, well, if you don't report and the perpetrator harms someone else, you'll probably feel really guilty. That is subtle victim blaming, implying that the survivor is responsible for preventing the perpetrator's future actions. The only person responsible is the perpetrator. And if a survivor is in that appeasement state, those kinds of subtle judgments may not only cause institutional trauma, but may also lead them to take actions that they don't actually want to take. We don't want them making a police report if they are only doing so to please you. I believe that one of the most important things that anyone working with survivors can do is to put power and agency back into their hands. So be on the lookout for the subtle ways that appeasement can open up opportunities to let you take that power away again. Now, as we talk about physiology and shame, we also need to discuss arousal nonconcordance. Now, those are some jargony words, so I want to define that. And I really appreciate the way that Emily Nagoski, pictured here, explains this concept. So I'm going to use her language. Nagoski explains that, and I'm quoting her here, the pleasure center of the brain is actually made of 3 separate but intertwined systems. Liking, the pleasure itself, wanting, which is motivation or desire, and expecting, which is associative learning. What she's pointing out is that expecting, or learning, is central to how our bodies respond to stimuli. Sometimes our bodies generate responses because we have learned in one way or another that stimulus is enjoyed or wanted. I mean, this is the basics, right? This is the reason that Pavlov's dogs famously salivate at the sound of the bell. It's not because they want to eat the bell, but it's because they've learned that the stimulus of the bell leads to something that they enjoy or want, which, of course, for the dogs was meat. So they have a physiological response due to their expectation of something that they like and want. Now, this is important because a sex-related stimulus may trigger a sex-related response, and that is arousal nonconcordance. Arousal nonconcordance explains why people sometimes experience erection, vaginal lubrication, ejaculation, and/or orgasm during unwanted contact. Because, and I'm quoting Nagoski again, our genitals do not know what we want. Our genitals only know what's sexually relevant. Genital response just means it was a sex-related stimulus. It doesn't mean it was wanted or liked. It certainly doesn't mean it was consented to. This is very hard for many people to talk about because the experience is so shame-filled. But many, many survivors experience genital response during assault. Survivors may have had an erection and ejaculation, or vaginal lubrication and orgasm. These facts are often used as proof that the survivor really wanted it. And that could not be farther from the truth. Just as I don't want to laugh when I'm tickled, a person's desire has nothing to do with the physical response that their genitals have to sex-related stimuli. And you can imagine that when I work with people on developing a healthy relationship to sexuality after experiencing sexual violence, that this can be incredibly complex psychologically. They may have learned to associate that genital response with violence and find themselves, after assault, wanting to be able to experience sexual intimacy and pleasure, but associating it so strongly with violence that they are unable to become aroused without trauma. Now, this is not something I bring up casually when I talk about survivors. I don't throw this out every time I walk into a room. But I believe that knowing this is essential for anyone who is working with survivors. You may have a survivor who shares this directly, or you may have a survivor who alludes to it. And in moments like that, gently normalizing and destigmatizing can be life-saving. When I hear these kinds of experiences come up, I'll often say, a lot of people feel shame about how their body responded during an experience of sexual violence. But the body often does its own thing, even when we don't want it to. It's really normal and natural to have a physical response to touch, even when that touch is unwanted. Your physical response was not consent, and it did not have anything to do with whether or not you wanted what happened. So let's round all of this out with some survivor-centered, consent-centered practices. When you're working with a survivor, whether during a safe exam or while providing medical care in the acute aftermath, there are some simple things that you can do to center them in your practice. First, let's start with a mindset practice. Recognize the effects of systemic oppression in sexual and reproductive care, and learn about it. We already had a really brief introduction to this earlier, but I really recommend reading more deeply about the history of medical bias and abuse to fully understand how those histories affect the medical system today. 3 texts I recommend all the time are Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid, Dorothy Roberts' Killing the Black Body, and Adam Cohen's Imbeciles. I basically consider these required reading. Knowing this history will help you better recognize and address biases within the medical system, and I believe that it can also change our mindset when we work with patients. The ancestral trauma of these histories affect how people feel today and how they relate to their medical care and medical care providers. A clinician who knows nothing about why a patient might be suspicious or distrustful of the medical system can't give that patient the individualized care they need. So do the work. Patients might not trust you or trust the system. You can't change that instantly, but you can work with them if you understand what's going on. Second, when you're speaking with patients, work on using language that is clear and comprehensible, not jargony and technical, and translate for them whenever possible. The sexual and reproductive healthcare knowledge gap might be profound, so you might have to do some gentle education in the moment. I can't tell you how often I've worked with someone who never had the chance to learn how their reproductive system works and therefore doesn't know why they're being offered, for example, emergency contraception. In a moment like that, giving them some translation, some gentle education might be really helpful. They might need some simple, clear information about what those medicines do so that they can make an informed choice. And I might have to translate from slang to medical terms or the other way around. Though it can feel really awkward in the moment, sometimes we have to use the language that is most understandable to our clients. For example, I was once advocating for a survivor during her SAFE exam, and the SANE was asking questions about ejaculation that just were not getting across. Finally, the survivor looked at me with a face full of question marks, and I realized that she didn't know what the words meant. So I just asked, "Are any of the words that you're hearing unfamiliar?" And she said, "Yeah, what does ejaculation mean?" And so I described it. An ejaculation is when a person with a penis has semen come out of their penis. And she said, "Oh, you mean nutting." Now, if I hadn't worked as a sex educator for years, I might have fallen off my stool in that moment. But because of my training, I was able to keep my body language really neutral and say, yeah, nutting is a casual term for having an ejaculation. Did the perpetrator nut anywhere on your body? Instead of shaming her for her knowledge or making her feel uncomfortable about the term that she used, the SANE started using the terms together, saying, do you think that there is any nut or ejaculate that we might want to test for on your skin? And she also started describing things more simply, saying things like, what about penetration of your anus, or what sometimes people call butt sex? If the SANE had referred to anal rape as forced butt sex in a different context, I would have hated it. But in that moment, she was helping the survivor translate from one context or framework to another. And that's really important. We have to meet people where they're at. Now, for those of you who code switch in your daily life, you probably recognize this skill and you have a leg up in this. So for folks who aren't often engaging in code switching, I recommend that you look to the examples of your colleagues who code switch regularly between, cultural dialects and the sort of dominant culture dialect, and really, use them as the kinds of examples of translation that kind of code switching really is. Another really important survivor-centered practice here is to use gender-inclusive language, because we cannot assume anything about a person's identities based on their biology. And I think that the easiest way to do this is to just separate language about bodies from language about identities. Now, of course, if we're thinking about using gender-inclusive language and also translating to whatever framework is most comfortable for clients, that might mean sometimes using language that isn't as inclusive because it's what makes sense to that client. And I think that this is a difficult but important balancing act. I don't want to use or replicate harmful or oppressive narratives, but if I'm speaking to someone who doesn't understand what I mean when I ask them their pronouns, for example, I might be causing harm by continuing to use language that just isn't making any sense to them. So we want to balance these things and think about ways that we can be really inclusive and egalitarian in our language without also being opaque or elitist or making people feel that their framework is inappropriate. And finally, work on using neutral subjects. Now, to bring everyone back to their elementary school grammar lessons, when I say neutral subjects, I mean literally the subject of the sentence. Think about how different these two sentences feel. When you have a SAFE exam, you might have a speculum put into your vagina. Versus, when a person has a SAFE exam, they might have a speculum put into their vagina. The change is subtle, but it can make a big difference in how it feels to hear that sentence. Using you as the subject can feel like a demand. You have to do this. or it can feel like their body is already being acted upon. In contrast, using something neutral like a person or people lets the survivor have a little emotional distance, right? Their vagina isn't being implicated directly, and it doesn't imply what they should or shouldn't do. That neutrality lets them decide what's best for them. And really, honestly, we could say just practice neutrality overall. Reacting neutrally to discussions of sex is really important. You may get asked questions about types of sex that you find weird or gross or uncomfortable. If you recoil, you teach the survivor that there's something repellent about them. The same goes for any discussion of their sexual behaviors or desires before or after. No matter what kind of sex a survivor is having or fantasizing about, the only thing that matters is their enthusiastic consent. Sexual desire is morally neutral as long as it is consent-based. And so we need to really work when we are talking to clients about sex and sexuality on bringing that moral neutrality. So finally, let's talk about some recommendations for how to center consent in your clinical practice. And again, the histories are important here. I could go on and on about so-called heroic medicine and how damaging it can be to the notions of consent. But in the interest of time, I'll just say that Western medicine, especially emergency medicine, does not have a great track record of centering consent, let alone informed consent. So we have to actively work to center consent, and that's particularly important when we're working with people who have just experienced sexual violence, or when we're working with people in areas related to sex and sexuality. We need to model for them the kind of consent that they deserve. So how can we do that? Well, first, disclose your reporting status upfront. I honestly think that anyone who is a mandated reporter should be disclosing their status anytime they're interacting with a client. Because mandated reporting doesn't care about whether the survivor consents to the report. So we have to give them the opportunity to decide what and how they share with us if we might have to break their confidence. This does not mean that you should say, wait, don't tell me or I'll have to report. But it does mean starting your relationship off honestly. I recommend that you include your status in your introduction. For example, if I were in that situation, I could say, "Hi, I'm Martina. I'm here to take care of you today, and I want you to know that I'm something called a mandated reporter. So there's some information that if you share it with me, I'll have to disclose to law enforcement or DHS. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what that means and what kind of information I have to report and what information I can keep confidential?" Some survivors are ready to make a report and don't care. Others need some time to decide. Others might want to disclose some things and not others. Some might think that mandated reporting means that you're going to disclose their medical information elsewhere. So really giving them a chance to ask questions and make choices is important. Second, in keeping with the neutrality that we've talked about really for the last couple minutes, work on being neutral about the survivor's behaviors and decisions. And that includes behaviors and decisions that you disagree with. You might want that survivor to take prophylaxis or emergency contraception, but what you want doesn't actually matter. Clients are allowed to make decisions that you think are dangerous, risky, even stupid. And you can offer them your guidance and medical advice without pressuring them. Here's a really extreme example of how harmful and manipulative this kind of pressure can be. One of my colleagues was once advocating for a survivor in the ED who hadn't yet decided whether to report. And when she arrived, she asked if the survivor needed anything. And the survivor said, "Yeah, I'm really thirsty, but the charge nurse won't give me water." And so she asked why, knowing that there are many medical reasons why this person might not be allowed to take fluids. It turned out that the nurse didn't want the survivor to destroy evidence in her throat. Now, that nurse almost certainly had really good intentions, but she also had a strong opinion. She believed that the survivor should report and that the highest priority was protecting the crime scene. But the survivor's priority was her own comfort. And in that moment, all that matters is what the survivor says she needs. So a neutral way to have that conversation with the survivor could have gone like this. When the survivor asked for water, the nurse could say, "I can definitely get you water if you're thirsty. I do want to let you know that if there's evidence inside of a person's throat, drinking water could prevent us from collecting that evidence. So you get to make the choice. All I care about is that you're comfortable and that you get to make the choices that feel right to you. So what sounds best?" The same principle can be used in really any setting. Again, you might want somebody to take post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, but we don't want to say to them, "You have to do this," or "If you don't do this, you're making a mistake." Instead, we can say, "It is absolutely my medical recommendation that the safest medical choice you could make right now would be to take that medication, but I support whatever decision you're most comfortable with." And finally, maybe this is a good moment to say that you can partner with the advocate. Maybe that's something that I can say that is easier for me than it is for you because of our different roles. My job as an advocate, anybody's job as an advocate, is to be there to support the survivor. You, the sane, and I, the advocate, our goals are probably aligned. Advocates are never there to be antagonists or to get in your way or to countermand your authority. We're just there to advocate for the survivor. So if you're getting the sense that the survivor doesn't want to say something to you, perhaps they'd feel more comfortable talking with me. I have really appreciated it when sanes have said, "Do you want to talk about this with your advocate first? I can step out." Just offering that chance for the survivor to have a confidential discussion with me can make them feel safer to talk with you. You're proving to them that their consent matters. I often check in with survivors about whether they think they're going to have a hard time speaking up if they're uncomfortable. And a lot of the time they say, yeah, they have a really hard time advocating for themselves. Often it's that fawn or appease response. And so in those moments, I often sort of make an arrangement with them. Okay, we'll make a secret signal. If I see you touch your nose, I'll know it's time for me to ask for a break. As a sane, you could use the advocate in the same way. Right? Maybe say to the survivor, "If you ever feel uncomfortable with anything that I'm doing, you can speak up. But if you don't feel comfortable saying that to me, you can turn and tell your advocate, and the advocate will tell me." Those are all ways that you are showing the survivor that the most important thing is their consent. So I'm going to end with some praxis. We'll do more of this in the discussion session, but I want to offer you a chance to do some solo practice here. So I'm going to put up 3 examples of language and give you a chance to reframe. After each example, you can pause and come up with your own reframe and then press play to see mine. My language is obviously not the only good language option. So if our versions are different, that is fine. The goal here is to think of reframes and alternatives. When you're done, think about whether there are any scenarios that you want to workshop in our discussion session. So let's start. Did you have oral sex with the perpetrator? Pause and come up with a reframe. Here's my version. Was there contact between the perpetrator's genitals and your mouth? How about between the perpetrator's mouth and your genitals? Here's another. You'll need to take PEP if the perpetrator is high risk for HIV. There are some medications that we can offer to reduce the risk of contracting a sexually transmitted infection. PEP, for example, can reduce the risk of HIV infection. Are you interested in talking more about that? Were you drinking tonight? I'd like to ask about alcohol and drugs so that I can make sure we give you the right medical care. Is that okay with you? So if there are any scenarios that you want to workshop in our discussion session, you can send those to me in advance. If you're comfortable sending an email to me, you're welcome to do that. If you prefer anonymity, you can use the form. At this point, if we were live, I would make time for questions, but instead I will hold that until we meet for our live discussion session. Thank you so much for your attention and for sticking out through this long video. Please feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Martina Shabram. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator at SAS, and my email address is allies@sas-lane.org. I also always appreciate your feedback, so you can fill out our feedback form at bit.ly/sasfeedback. Thank you.